Welcome to another episode of Elevated Minis. My name is Cody, and in this video we're going to put my mediocre sculpting skills to the test and convert an awakened Wyldwood tree into a Weirwood tree that is inspired by this picture here. It's from the first episode of Game of Thrones, and I really wanted to create something similar. This would make a great centerpiece for your gaming table and applicable to many of your tabletop games. Since there's a lot of ground to cover with this, I'm only going to focus on the conversion and sculpting process in this video and follow it up with the painting process in part 2. Make sure you hit that subscribe and bell button to be notified when I release that. Without further ado, let's get started. So before I had this idea, I primed up this tree and skeleton bone from the army painter because I was initially going to use only contrast paint on it, but with anything I do, I always end up coming up with other ideas and needing to backtrack and fix a bit. In order to sculpt the face on the tree, I needed a little bit bigger of a surface area to work on, so I used a hobby knife to cut off a few of these mushrooms that are on the side. You gotta be careful if you try something like this and always try to cut away from yourself. An argument could be made that I should have tried to incorporate the mushrooms into the face, but there's no turning back now. So preparing to sculpt the face on the tree, I used some green stuff, which is a 2-part epoxy putty that will pretty much stick to anything, and it has a relatively long working time before it starts to set. There's plenty of things you could use instead of this, but this is what I have on hand. So what you do is you cut off equal parts of the putty and mix them together until it turns one consistent color of green. The stuff can get pretty sticky, so use a little water on your fingers to prevent that. So I thought I would show you guys my first attempt at this because it's pretty comical, but I think it's important to see missteps along the way if I can, because you can usually learn from them. I initially rolled out really thin logs and thought I would make little circles for the eyes and mouth. But the biggest problem with this is I couldn't get the eyes even remotely close in size to each other. I ended up mashing them up or distorting how they looked in a bad way. After I ripped off the previous attempt, I created the nose first by making an elongated oval basically, and then cut a diagonal on both sides at the bottom to create the nostrils. Keep in mind, I'm no sculptor and I'm probably doing this all wrong and using the wrong sculpting tools, but that's okay. I'm learning here. I'll always stress to try new things even if you end up failing. Once I was happy with the nose, I moved on to the eyes by rolling 2 pieces of the green stuff into little balls. I needed to try a few times to get the scale that I felt matched the nose. I used one of the pointy sculpting tools to indent the eyes. I don't know the names of these tools, so if you're a sculptor, leave a comment and let me know. But I shaped them into somewhat of an expression that I had in mind for this. The biggest challenge I set out for myself with this was to try my best to make it look like the face was a part of the tree, and not just like I had plopped it on there. It could be argued whether I was successful or not, but I was pretty happy with how this turned out. One way I tried to blend this into the tree was I really pressed along the edges of the green stuff into the tree to really try to capture the texture that was underneath of it. For the mouth, I took the same approach as I did with the eyes and made a rough shape of it before sticking it on. I then used a sculpting tool to make the expression and really worked the edges of the green stuff into the tree to blend it in the best I could. After about 10 minutes, this is how it ended up. I used the tip of this tool to really get into the grooves of the bark underneath and to hopefully sell that I just didn't plop the face on there. Leave a comment and let me know how I did. Once I was finished with the green stuff, I needed to make the base. I knew it needed to be on something sturdy since I was going to be using some resin, so I went with a 1/4 inch MDF that I picked up from the hardware store. I drew the shape of what would eventually become the pond before cutting it out and beveling the edges with some sandpaper. I didn't capture that on video because I didn't really have a great way to set up for that, but this stuff is pretty easy to cut even with a handsaw, so once that was finished, I super glued the tree onto the base. With that all glued down, I pulled out the Sculptamold. To mix this stuff up, you just make about a 2-to-1 mix of Sculptamold to water into a cottage cheese type consistency. I intentionally did a little less water than that so I could build up the banks of the pond a bit easier. It's really not that hard to work with, you just have to play with it to really understand how it works, and I highly recommend picking it up if you haven't already. It makes the most natural looking landforms for any variety of your terrain projects. I built up the banks of the pond to be slightly higher than the model to create a well for the resin that I would pour in later to give it more depth. I also filled in all the areas of the model that weren't tree limbs, rocks, or bones because I didn't particularly care for the modeled ground cover. I tried my best to make it look as natural as I could instead of having it look like I just plopped it onto a base. Having said that, it's time for a time lapse. To add a little texture and natural elements to this, so I added a few stones and pebbles that I picked up from the dollar store. You could also grab some from your driveway if you wanted to, but just stick these right into the Sculptamold and it works just like glue. I didn't want a ton of these, so I just placed them around randomly. So with all the rocks placed, the Sculptamold had dried enough to where I could start to smooth it out a bit and also fill in any more gaps that I felt needed it. And for my final bit of this video, I took gray primer from Vallejo through the airbrush and got the tree ready for some paint. You don't need to use an airbrush for this, just use any gray or white primer rattle can you happen to have. I only used the airbrush because I ran out of the bone primer I had used previously. I was mainly only concerned with covering the face on the tree, the rocks, and the surface of the pond. So that's it for part 1 of this 2-part series, and I really hope you guys enjoyed it. If you'd like to be notified when I release the second part of this series, hit that subscribe and bell button for me so you don't miss out. I'll do the best I can to get that out to you guys as quickly as possible. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up or leave a comment to let me know how I'm doing or what you'd like to see in the future. And until next time guys, thanks again.